The night my house burned down, my neighbor Karen stood across the street, smiling. At least, that's what it looked like in the glow of the flames. Fire trucks screamed down the quiet suburban road, their red lights flashing against the smoke that poured from my roof. Firefighters rushed past me with hoses, shouting orders while neighbors gathered on their lawns in pajamas and robes. But Karen, she stood perfectly still on her front porch, watching. My house had been my sanctuary for 7 years. A small but beautiful 2-story place with a wide oak tree in the yard and a driveway that caught the morning sunlight. I bought it because it was peaceful, quiet, private, or at least, that's what I thought before the homeowners association decided they needed one more obedient resident. Karen was the president of that HOA, and from the moment I moved in, she made sure I knew it. The first letter arrived 3 days after I unpacked my last box. It was a formal invitation, though demand would have been a better word, asking me to join the association and follow their neighborhood guidelines. I politely declined. The neighborhood had older properties, and technically my house sat just outside the HOA boundary. Legally, I didn't have to join. Karen didn't like that. Over the next few months, she knocked on my door several times. Each conversation followed the same pattern. "You should really join the HOA," she'd say with that tight smile. "I appreciate the offer," I'd reply, "but I'm not interested." At first she tried persuasion. Then she tried pressure. Then came the threats disguised as warnings. She'd complain about my lawn height, my fence color, even the type of mailbox I installed. None of it actually fell under HOA authority. But Karen didn't seem to care about technicalities. She cared about control. One afternoon, she stood at the edge of my driveway with a clipboard in her hand and said something I'd never forget. "People who refuse to cooperate with this community usually regret it." At the time, I assumed she meant fines or neighborhood complaints. Petty stuff. The kind of drama homeowners associations are famous for. I never imagined the situation would escalate into something far darker. And now, as the fire consumed the living room where I'd spent so many quiet evenings, I couldn't stop replaying that sentence in my mind. People who refuse to cooperate regret it. A firefighter touched my shoulder. "Sir, we've contained most of it," he said gently. I nodded, barely hearing him. Across the street, Karen was still standing there, watching, and for just a moment, when the flames reflected in her eyes, I could swear she looked disappointed the fire wasn't bigger. But what Karen didn't know that night was something that would change everything. Because this story wasn't going to end with my house burning down. It was going to end in a courtroom. And when Karen finally saw who was presiding over that courtroom, she was going to wish she had never lit that match. The fire took less than 40 minutes to destroy most of my house. That's the strange thing about fire. Something that took years of work, savings, and quiet evenings to build can disappear in under an hour. By midnight, the flames were gone, leaving behind blackened walls, broken windows, and the thick smell of smoke drifting across the neighborhood. Firefighters rolled up their hoses while police officers spoke with the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch. Karen was still there. She had moved closer now, standing near the curb with her arms folded, watching the firefighters like someone observing a routine inconvenience. Not like someone witnessing a disaster. When the fire chief approached me, his expression was serious. "Do you know how the fire might have started?" he asked. I shook my head slowly. "No." He glanced toward the house. "We found evidence suggesting it may not have been accidental." The words hung in the cold night air. "Not accidental. Arson." The officer beside him scribbled something into a small notebook. "Has anyone threatened you recently?" he asked. For a moment, I hesitated. Then my eyes drifted across the street. Karen noticed. She quickly turned away and pretended to speak with another neighbor. I looked back at the officer. "There's been tension with someone from the HOA," I admitted. He nodded slowly. "We'll need to look into that." While investigators began examining the burned structure, I sat on the curb across the street, wrapped in a borrowed blanket one of the neighbors had brought. My mind replayed every interaction I'd ever had with Karen. Every warning, every argument, every thinly veiled threat. About 20 minutes later, one of the investigators approached the police officer. They spoke quietly for a moment. Then both of them looked toward Karen's house. My stomach tightened. The officer walked over to her porch. "Ma'am," he said politely, "could we ask you a few questions?" Karen's confident smile returned instantly. "Of course, officer. I'd be happy to help." From where I sat, I could see her talking calmly, gesturing occasionally toward my house like she was explaining something. But something about the conversation felt off. Her body language was too relaxed, too controlled, like someone who had already prepared exactly what she planned to say. After several minutes, the officer nodded and walked back toward the investigation area. Karen remained on her porch, watching everything unfold. Our eyes met briefly across the street. She smiled again, but this time the smile wasn't polite. It was smug, like she believed she had already won. The investigation continued well into the early morning. By sunrise, the fire crew had finished their work, leaving behind yellow caution tape around the charred remains of my home. The police officer approached me once more before leaving. "We're going to continue investigating this as possible arson," he said. "Do you suspect someone?" I asked. He paused. "We're not ruling anything out." Across the street, Karen stepped inside her house and closed the door. At that moment, I had no solid proof she was involved. Just suspicion. Just instinct. But instinct can be powerful. Because deep down, I already knew something Karen didn't. She thought the fire had ended the story. She thought she had destroyed my home and scared me away. But Karen had no idea who I really was. And very soon, she was going to find out. By the next afternoon, the news had spread through the neighborhood. People whispered about the fire at mailboxes, on sidewalks, and in small clusters near the community park. Most of them spoke with sympathy. Others spoke with curiosity, and a few glanced nervously toward Karen's house before lowering their voices. I spent the morning dealing with insurance agents, investigators, and contractors who were assessing the damage. My house wasn't completely gone, but the fire had destroyed nearly half of it. The living room, kitchen, and upstairs hallway were blackened ruins. Smoke damage had crept into almost every corner. But what bothered me more than the damage itself was the question hanging over everything. Who did it? By mid-afternoon, a police investigator returned to the property. His name was Detective Ramirez, and he carried the calm, focused expression of someone who had investigated more fires than he cared to count. "We found something," he said. My attention sharpened immediately. "What kind of something?" He walked me toward the caution tape surrounding the front porch. "There are clear signs the fire started near the side entrance," he explained. "And we located traces of an accelerant." "Gasoline?" I asked. He nodded. "Most likely." My jaw tightened. "That confirms arson. It strongly suggests it," Ramirez replied. He glanced toward the houses across the street. "Now we need to figure out who had motive." Motive. That word brought Karen's face straight back into my mind. I told the detective everything. About the HOA. About the letters. About the threats disguised as warnings. About the sentence she had spoken in my driveway. People who refuse to cooperate with this community usually regret it. Ramirez listened carefully, writing notes in a small black notebook. When I finished, he looked thoughtful. "Interesting," he said quietly. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means we'll be talking to her again." Across the street, Karen's house looked peaceful. Her front lawn was perfectly trimmed. Her WA flag hung neatly beside the porch. Everything about her property looked like the model image of suburban order. But appearances can be deceptive. Ramirez and another officer walked toward her house. From where I stood, I watched them knock on her door. Karen opened it after a moment. Even from a distance, I could see the shift in her posture when she realized the police were back. This time, her smile looked thinner, more cautious. The officers spoke with her for several minutes. Karen gestured frequently, occasionally pointing toward my damaged house. Then something unexpected happened. The officers asked if they could step inside. Karen hesitated, just for a moment. Then she stepped aside and let them enter. They stayed inside for almost 15 minutes. When they finally came back out, their expressions were serious. Ramirez walked back toward me slowly. "Well?" I asked. He studied my face for a moment before answering. "We're still gathering information," he said carefully. That didn't sound like a denial. But it also wasn't confirmation. Across the street, Karen stood in her doorway watching us again. But this time, The smug confidence from the night before had faded slightly. Maybe she realized something had changed. Maybe she sensed the investigation was moving in a direction she hadn't expected. But Karen still believed something important. She believed she could control the situation. She believed she could manipulate the story. And most of all, she believed I was just another homeowner she could push around. What she didn't realize yet was that the next time she saw me, it wouldn't be across the street. It would be in a courtroom. And when that moment arrived, the look on her face would be something I'd never forget. 3 days after the fire, the official investigation intensified. Detective Ramirez called me early that morning. "We found something you should see," he said. His tone was calm, but there was a weight behind his words that immediately caught my attention. When I arrived at the police station, Ramirez led me into a small interview room. A laptop sat on the table, paused on a grainy video frame. "What am I looking at?" I asked. Ramirez pressed play. The footage showed a quiet suburban street late at night. My street. The timestamp read 1:42 a.m., just minutes before the fire had started. A figure walked into view from the far end of the block. The person wore a hoodie and moved quickly along the sidewalk toward my house. Even through the dark camera footage, I could see the person carrying something in their hand. A small container. The figure disappeared briefly behind the large oak tree in my front yard. 30 seconds later, they reappeared. And then they ran. Seconds after they left the frame, a faint orange glow began to appear near the side of my house. The video ended. I sat there, silently for a moment. "That's security footage?" I asked. Ramirez nodded. "Your neighbor 2 houses down has a camera facing the street. Can you tell who it is?" I asked. "Not clearly yet," he admitted. "But we're enhancing the footage." My mind raced. Someone had clearly set the fire. And whoever it was had known exactly where to pour the gasoline. They had targeted the side entrance, the spot that would allow flames to spread quickly through the lower floor. That wasn't random. That was deliberate. Ramirez leaned back slightly in his chair. "There's something else," he added. He pulled out a photograph and slid it across the table. It showed a gas can sitting inside a garage. A garage I recognized instantly. "Karen's. We obtained a warrant," Ramirez explained. "During the search we found this." The gas can was red, plastic, and about half full. But what caught my attention wasn't the container. It was the label. A small WA sticker was attached to the side. Apparently Karen used the can for maintaining the neighborhood lawn equipment. Ramirez tapped the photo lightly. "We're testing it for chemical matches with the accelerant used at your house." I leaned back slowly. "So you think it was her?" He shook his head slightly. "I think we're getting closer to answers." Across the street, Karen had probably spent the last few days believing she had gotten away with everything. She probably assumed the fire would remain unsolved. Insurance would cover the damage. And eventually I would move away. Problem solved. But investigations don't work like that. Truth has a way of surfacing. Sometimes slowly, sometimes all at once. And Karen's calm confidence was about to face its first real challenge. Because the lab results on that gasoline can would arrive within 48 hours. And if they matched the accelerant found at my house, the next knock on Karen's door wouldn't be from a detective asking questions. It would be from police officers making an arrest. But even that wouldn't be the moment that shocked her the most. The real shock would come later. Much later. Inside a courtroom. When Karen looked up at the bench and realized exactly who had been listening to the entire case. And by then, there would be no escape. 48 hours later, Detective Ramirez called again. "Lab results are back," he said. I could hear something different in his voice this time, certainty. I met him outside my damaged house that afternoon. The smell of burned wood still lingered in the air, and the yellow caution tape fluttered gently in the breeze. Ramirez stepped out of his car holding a small folder. "They matched," he said. My chest tightened. "The gasoline from Karen's garage is chemically identical to the accelerant found at your house." For a moment, the street felt completely silent. "So that's it?" I asked. "You can arrest her." Ramirez shook his head slightly. Almost. We still need to confirm the person in the video." Right on cue, another officer walked over with a tablet in his hand. "We enhanced the footage," he said. He turned the screen toward us. The grainy figure from the night video was clearer now. Not perfectly clear, but clear enough. The person removed the hood briefly as they reached the side of my house. Just long enough for the camera to catch their face. My stomach dropped. It was Karen. There was no mistaking it. Her sharp haircut, her posture, her face, standing there in the dim streetlight, holding the gasoline can. Ramirez exhaled slowly. That's enough for a warrant. Within 2 hours, police cars were parked outside Karen's house. Neighbors peeked through windows again, just like they had on the night of the fire. But this time the flashing lights weren't for firefighters. They were for an arrest. Karen opened her door when the officers knocked. At first she looked confused, then irritated. Then the moment she saw Ramirez holding the warrant, her expression changed completely. Shock. What is this about? She demanded. You're under arrest for suspected arson, Ramirez said calmly. Karen laughed. Actually laughed. This is ridiculous. But when the officers showed her the enhanced video still on the tablet, the color drained from her face. That's not proof, she said quickly. Anyone could look like that. Maybe, Ramirez replied, but the gasoline matches too. For the first time since I had met her, Karen looked genuinely afraid. The handcuffs clicked around her wrists, and the neighbors watched in stunned silence as she was escorted to the patrol car. As the door closed behind her, Karen's eyes locked onto mine across the street. If looks could burn houses, that glare might have finished the job. But this time, the fire was over, or so she thought, because Karen still believed something important. She believed the court system would save her. She believed a good lawyer would make the charges disappear. She believed the judge would see things her way. And she had absolutely no idea who that judge was going to be. Karen was released on bail the next morning. News of the arrest traveled through the neighborhood faster than the original fire. By lunchtime, nearly everyone on the block knew what had happened. Some neighbors were shocked, others were quietly satisfied. After months of Karen's constant warnings, letters, and complaints, people were finally seeing a different side of the woman who claimed to protect the community. But Karen wasn't finished fighting. 2 days later, her lawyer filed an official response to the charges. Arson, property destruction, reckless endangerment. The evidence against her was strong, but her attorney immediately began attacking the investigation. The video is unclear, he argued in the filing. The gasoline could belong to anyone. The accusations are based on personal conflict between neighbors. In other words, they were trying to paint the entire situation as a misunderstanding. Karen's lawyer even suggested that I might have staged the evidence myself. That part almost made me laugh. Detective Ramirez called me again that afternoon. They're going to fight this hard, he warned. I expected that, I replied. Ramirez paused before asking the question that had clearly been on his mind for days. There's something I've been meaning to ask. Go ahead. Why haven't you seemed surprised by any of this? I smiled slightly. Because I know how these things usually play out. Ramirez raised an eyebrow. And how is that? I've seen a lot of courtroom arguments before. That answer seemed to satisfy his curiosity, for the moment. But what he didn't know was that my familiarity with courtrooms went far beyond watching cases unfold from the gallery. Meanwhile, Karen's confidence was slowly returning. After her release, she was seen walking around the neighborhood again, speaking with her lawyer on the phone and telling anyone who would listen that the accusations were absurd. According to her, the police had rushed to judgment. According to her, she was the victim of harassment. And according to her, the court would clear her name. What Karen didn't realize was that the court date had already been scheduled. The trial would begin in just over 3 weeks. During those weeks, investigators gathered even more evidence. Forensic tests confirmed the gasoline used at my house came from the same brand and batch found in Karen's garage. The security footage was enhanced again. Witnesses came forward, including one neighbor who reported seeing Karen walking near my property late that night. Bit by bit, the case grew stronger. And Karen grew quieter. By the time the trial date finally arrived, the entire neighborhood knew about it. Some of them even planned to attend the hearing. But Karen still believed something important. She believed the courtroom would be her stage. She believed the judge would be just another stranger sitting behind the bench. Someone she could charm. Someone she could manipulate. Someone who would never suspect the truth. But the morning of the trial, when Karen walked into the courtroom and looked toward the judge's bench for the first time, everything she believed was about to collapse. The morning of the trial arrived cold and quiet. Outside the courthouse, people moved in and out of the large stone building while reporters and attorneys hurried through the front steps. It looked like any normal day at the courthouse. But for Karen, it was anything but normal. She walked into the building with her lawyer beside her, dressed in a sharp gray suit and carrying the same confident posture she had always used in the neighborhood. To anyone watching, she looked calm. But inside, she was nervous. Her lawyer whispered to her as they approached the courtroom doors. "Remember," he said quietly, "the evidence isn't perfect. We just need to create reasonable doubt." Karen nodded. "I know." Inside the courtroom, several people from the neighborhood had already taken seats in the gallery. Mrs. Reynolds sat near the front. Tom and Linda were there too. Even Detective Ramirez stood near the back wall, arms crossed as he waited for the hearing to begin. Karen noticed them all, and she forced herself to smile, as if none of this bothered her. Her lawyer placed his briefcase on the defense table. "We'll be fine," he said. Karen glanced toward the empty judge's bench at the front of the room. The large chair behind the bench was still vacant. The courtroom clerk shuffled paperwork while the bailiff stood near the door. "Court will begin shortly," the bailiff announced. Karen exhaled slowly. Everything still felt under control. After all, judges were strangers. They looked at facts. They listened to arguments. They didn't know the people involved. And that worked in her favor. At least, that's what she believed. Suddenly, the bailiff's voice echoed across the courtroom. "All rise." Everyone in the room stood up. Karen straightened her jacket and turned toward the door behind the bench. The courtroom door opened, and the judge walked in. At first, Karen didn't notice anything unusual. She glanced down at her paperwork. Then she looked up, and froze, because the man walking to the bench was someone she recognized instantly. The same man she had argued with in his driveway. The same man whose house she had watched burn. For a moment, Karen's brain refused to process what she was seeing. Her lawyer leaned closer and whispered urgently. "Is something wrong?" Karen's voice barely came out. That's him." "Who?" "The homeowner." Her lawyer looked toward the bench in confusion. But by then, I had already taken my seat. The courtroom fell silent. I adjusted the papers in front of me and looked across the room. Directly at Karen. Her face had gone completely pale. And for the first time since this entire situation began, Karen realized something terrifying. She hadn't just burned a neighbor's house. She had burned the house of the judge presiding over her case. The courtroom stayed completely silent. Karen stared at the bench like she had just seen a ghost. Her confident posture from earlier had vanished. The woman who once stood in my driveway issuing law warnings now looked frozen in her chair, gripping the edge of the defense table. Her lawyer leaned closer again. "Karen, what's going on?" Her voice was barely audible. "That's him," she whispered again. "That's the man whose house burned." Her lawyer frowned and looked toward the bench. At that moment, the full realization hit him too. He immediately stood up. "Your Honor," he said quickly. The entire courtroom turned toward him. "Yes," I replied calmly. "Your Honor," the lawyer continued carefully, "it appears there may be a conflict of interest in this case." Of course there was. But the courtroom had already prepared for that moment. I nodded once. "You're correct, Counselor." Karen blinked rapidly, confused by how calm the situation felt. She had expected panic, chaos, anger. Instead, everything was controlled, professional, predictable. I folded my hands on the bench. "For the record," I said clearly, "I disclosed this potential conflict as soon as the case was assigned." The judicial board reviewed the situation. Karen's lawyer looked surprised. And I will not be presiding over the final verdict." Karen let out a small breath of relief. For a moment, she thought she had escaped the worst possible scenario. But she misunderstood something important. Because the damage to her case had already been done. The courtroom doors opened again. Another judge entered and took the secondary bench beside mine. Judge Harrison, a veteran of 20 years on the bench. A man known for being extremely strict when it came to criminal evidence. Karen's lawyer's shoulders sank slightly. He understood immediately. This wasn't good. I turned slightly toward Judge Harrison. "The court will now proceed," I announced. Karen tried to recover her composure. But the shock had already shaken her confidence. The prosecution began presenting evidence. The enhanced security footage, the gasoline match from her garage, witness testimony placing her near my house that night. Each piece of evidence landed like another brick on the case against her. Karen's lawyer tried to argue, tried to create doubt, but the evidence was overwhelming. By the end of the hearing, the courtroom was completely silent again. Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and looked down at the documents. Then he looked directly at Karen. Based on the evidence presented, he said firmly, this court finds sufficient grounds to proceed with full criminal charges for arson. Karen's shoulders collapsed. For the first time since this began, the woman who once controlled the law had lost control of everything. And the worst part for her wasn't just the charges. It was the realization that everyone in the courtroom knew the truth, including the man whose house she tried to destroy. The courtroom was silent as Judge Harrison prepared to deliver the final decision. Karen sat motionless at the defense table. The confidence she once carried through the neighborhood, through law meetings, warnings, and threats, had completely disappeared. Her lawyer quietly shuffled his papers, but even he seemed to understand the outcome was already clear. Across the room, the prosecutor finished organizing the last pieces of evidence. The security footage, the gasoline match, the witness statements, and most importantly, the timeline that placed Karen at my house minutes before the fire began. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly. Ms. Karen Whitfield, he said firmly, this court has reviewed the evidence carefully. Karen looked up slowly. Her eyes were red from hours of tension. You were entrusted with a leadership position in your community, the judge continued. Instead of protecting that community, you chose to abuse your authority. Karen's hands trembled on the table. You attempted to intimidate a neighbor into joining your homeowners association. When that failed, you escalated the conflict to an act of deliberate arson. The courtroom remained completely still. Judge Harrison continued. Arson is not simply property damage. It endangers lives. Fire spreads unpredictably, and the consequences can be catastrophic. Karen lowered her head. In this case, the judge said, the evidence leaves no reasonable doubt. He paused briefly before delivering the final words. This court finds you guilty of criminal arson and property destruction. Karen's shoulders collapsed. The bailiff stepped closer, ready for the next instruction. Judge Harrison continued reading the sentence. You will face a term of imprisonment, financial restitution for the damages caused, and permanent legal penalties associated with this conviction. Karen's lawyer placed a hand on her shoulder, but she barely reacted. Across the courtroom gallery, several neighbors exchanged quiet looks. No one celebrated, but there was a clear sense of justice finally being served. After the hearing ended, people slowly began leaving the courtroom. Detective Ramirez approached me near the back door. Well, he said quietly, that's one case I won't forget. I nodded. Neither will I. Outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun reflected off the glass buildings downtown. For the first time since the fire, the situation finally felt finished. Karen's attempt to control the neighborhood had ended in the one place she couldn't manipulate. A courtroom. Weeks later, construction crews began rebuilding my house. Neighbors who had once been afraid to speak against Karen now waved as they passed by. The neighborhood felt different, calmer, more respectful, and the lesson from the entire ordeal turned out to be simple. Power without accountability eventually collapses.
Karen believed she could intimidate anyone who refused to obey her rules. Instead, she discovered something far stronger than HOA authority, the rule of law, and once that rule dropped into the story, everything changed. If you enjoyed don't forget to subscribe to Karen Universe, share with your friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments.